Today's daf is daf Gimel, and we're continuing our study of Rabbah and his interpretation of Rab Shimon, and we'll start with Chatas Ha'of. We discussed yesterday about the difference between Chatas Ha'of and Olas Ha'of, two kinds of bird, karbonos, ophos, and one of the fundamental differences is that the Olas Ha'of is brought on the top of the Mizbeach, whereas the dam of the Chatasof is on the bottom of the Mizbeach. And the Gemara thinks that the difference is so obvious that if the Kohen makes a declaration, for example, that the Chatas Ha'of is really for the purpose of an Olas Ha'of or vice versa, it's going to be so obvious that the Kohen is saying something that's sheker v'chazov. It's just he's just lying through his teeth, and in such a case, the Shalol Lishma declaration of the Kohen doesn't register. So that was the understanding of Rabbah, because in the Brisa of Rabbi Shimon emphasizes that Maisav Mochiach Alav, that the reason why Rabbi Shimon says that in Menachos, as opposed to Zvachim, Shalol Lishma is Ola L'Shem Bailim, and it's a perfectly kosher mincha, is because the Shalol Lishma declaration of the Kohen is ridiculous. It's just it's just a null set. It doesn't make any sense because the way the carbon is being brought, for example, uh, you can't say, well, this is for the sake of Maseches when they prepared the flour in a machvas. So whenever it's absolutely discernible that the declaration of the Kohen is not true, then his declaration of Shalol Lishma does not register, and the carbon is kosher. And that's halacha in Menachos, as opposed to Zvachim, where all the avodos of Zvachim are identical, whether it's the Shechita, whether it's the Kabbalah, whether it's the Halacha or the Zrika, it's all identical. And therefore, when the Kohen makes a declaration that this is being shechted l'shem shlomim, when the original neder was l'shem ola, then it passes the carbon as far as being ola l'shem bailim, because the Shalol Lishma registers. And why does the Shalol Lishma register? And why is it pogame and it sort of undermines the perfection of the carbon? Is because it's not apparent to anyone who's watching that the declaration of the Kohen is incorrect. Maybe this is a shlomim, because the avoda of the shlomim is identical to the avoda of an olah. So such a Shalol Lishma registers, and that's the halach in Zvachim that we saw at the beginning of Maseches Zvachim, that it's lo olu l'bailim l'shem chova. But in Menachos, where there's such an obvious difference between this and that, there everybody understands that the Kohen's declaration is impossible, because the avodas hakarbon proves that it's not that, but it's that. So after doing this whole work with the ophos, the Gemara now moves on to a declaration of a case where the Kohen claims that this kmitza of the mincha is being done for the purpose of a chatas ha'of, and the question is, well, wait a second. If the neder was on an olas ha'of, then an olas ha'of requires what's called mitzui, which we mentioned yesterday, that the Kohen who does the malika on an olas ha'of, he then like squeezes the head of the bird after the malika, and the dam juts out and splatters on the mizbeach, which is not so for the case of chatos. And therefore, the Gemara thinks once again the declaration of the Kohen l'shem chatos in the case of an oath should be a ridiculous statement, because all the spectators saw the hazaya of mitzui, which is typical of an olas ha'of and not appropriate for chatas ha'of. So the last thing that we touched on yesterday, as we turn to the beginning of today's daf of Gimel Amid Aleph, was that even in the case of a chatas, eventually there will be mitzui. The difference between the ola and the chatas is that the mitzui in the case of an ola is up front. In the case of chatas, there's a mitzui that takes place following the hazah. So therefore, the spectator is going to say that when the Kohen declares that this is a korban ha'of l'shem chatas, then the people will take that very seriously, even though they see the mitzui, because they will attribute that mitzui to the mitzui of the chatas ha'of that follows the hazoyah. Okay, now we're going to start here on Daf Gimel with Kodshe Kodshim. So let's count down from the top of the Amud, approximately 8 or 9 lines down. And you'll see the two dots there following the words Velola Ophos. And the Gemara is still attacking and objecting to Rabba's definition of Rabbi Shimon, of Maisa Muchachim Olav, Kodshe Kodshim Sheshachtam B'tzafon L'Shem Kodshim Kalim Le'rotzu. There's a fundamental difference between the avoda, the shchita of a kodesh kadoshim, let's say, for example, a chatas or an asham, in that they require shchita in the tzaf on the northern part of the azara, whereas kodshim kalim are in the daram, in the southern part of the azara. And in the case where the korban was meant to be, and the neder that was taken by the original owner, the Bailim, was that it should be kodshe, it should be what's the first case the Gemara came with kodshe kodshim? Oh, where it should be where it should be kodshe kodshim, and he went ahead and he made a declaration, the Kohen, that he's shechting it l'shem kodshim kalim. But the only problem is he shechted it in the tzafon, which is proof positive that we're dealing with a korban chatos, or a korban asham, meaning kodshi kodshim. So once again, the declaration of the Kohen of Shalol Lishma for the sake of Shlomim is absolutely ridiculous. It's deceitful because if the shechita was done in the tzafon, obviously it's kodshim kodshim, and therefore leirotzu, the korban should be valid, because we'll apply the principle as Rabbah does in explaining the shita of Reb Shimon that Masei Mochikan of the Kodshim Kodshim Ninhu Di Kodshim Kalim B'Darim Havi Ovidle. If it was really in truth Kodshim Kalim, the way the Kohen declares it, then why was the shita done in the Daram? It should have been done. Why was it done in the Tzafon? It should have been done in the Daram. And the Gemara answers, Amor Diom Rachmana Af B'Daram. When the Torah says that Kodshim Kalim shechted in the daram, it doesn't mean it has to be shechted in the daram. It means it can be shechted in the daram. B'daram v'lo b'tzafon miyamar. It never said, the Torah never said that if the shechita of kodshim kalim was implemented in the tzafon, that would undermine the validity of the korban. That's not what the Torah is saying. The Torah is giving you an alternative of daram, but certainly tzafon, which is valid and required in the case of kodshim kodshim, would certainly be valid in the case of kodshim kalim. Tisnan, as we learned in a Mishnah, shchitasim b'chol makom ba'azara. Right, we say it every morning in the karbanos, that in kodshim kalim you could do the shchita anywhere in the azara, whether it be in the darom, which is the chiddush of kodshim kalim, or even in the tzafon, which is where we designate, and that's the exclusive location in the azara for the shchita of kodshim kodshim. So therefore, once again, we go back to our assumption that in this case, the spectators will be fooled to buy the story of the Kohen when he declares that this is Kachim Kalim. Why will we buy into the fact that it was L'Shem Kachim Kalim, even though the Shechita was done in the Tzaf, in the Daro? Because you could do, I'm sorry, even though the Shechita was done in the Tzafon, because in the case of Kachim Kalim, Shechita in the Tzafon is acceptable. The Gemara now raises the following question: "But kachim kalim sheshachtam v'darm l'shem kachim kachim." What about the reverse case, where the noder was bringing kachim kalim, and the whatchamacallit, the Kohen declared that he is shechting this l'shem kachim kachim, and the shechita was implemented in the daram. Now, if the Kohen is correct that this is kachim kachim, how can you do the shechita in the daram? That would completely invalidate the korban, and therefore the declaration of the Kohen of Shlo Lishma is obvious to be deceitful. And therefore, leiratzu, according to the principle of Rabbah in his understanding of Reb Shimon, namely that ma'asav mochichim and olav, it should be valid. Because otherwise, how could it be that it was shechted in the daram when shechita in the daram in the case of kachim kachim would passel the korban? The kachim kachim b'tzafon havi ovidle. It should have been done in the tzafon. How did he claim on the one hand that it's kachim kachim, and on the other hand the shechita was implemented in the daram? That's impossible. So now the Gemara takes a little bit of a change, like a bit of a different kind of a pitch, and the Gemara says, "Amrei kodshei kodshim ninu." People will accept and buy into the declaration of the Kohen of Shlo Lishma of kodshei kodshim. The shechita was done in the daram, and kodshei kodshim requires shechita in the tzafon. Mever hu di avar v'shachet lu b'daram. That enochinami, the person, it doesn't have to be a Kohen in the case of Shechita, but whoever went ahead and shechted the korban, and he shechted it in the daram, he violated the law. The Torah requires that the Shechita of kachim kachim must be implemented in the tzafon. He went ahead and he violated the Torah law, and he implemented the Shechita in the daram. And now people are going to say that, you know what, the Shlo Lishma declaration of the Kohen is really valid, and in truth, this korban is being brought for the sake of kodshei kodshim. It was shechted in the daram. That's because they messed up. If you're saying now that the spectator might raise the possibility that it was messed up, is then let's go back to square one. The whole discussion of Reb Shimon began with Menachos, and there were two types of Menachos. There was a Minchas Maseches and a Minchas Machvas, and he brought a Minchas Machvas. That was the nature of his pledge, to bring a Machvas. And the Kohen said, L'shem Maseches, I'm doing the Kmitza for the purpose of a different category of Mincha, namely a Maseches. And we said that such a statement, a declaration of the Kohen, according to Shimon, since it's meaningless, and it's obvious that it is deceitful because the actual flour was brought in a machvas, in a flat pan, so it can't be a macheches. Why not say, right, Nami, we'll say also in this case, Hai de kakomitz le lemarcheshes. The kmitza that was done in a flat pan was really just an error. In other words, it should have been done in a marcheshes, which would lead, as we said before, to a soft kind of a wafer. But haide kakomitz leila marcheshes amar is high marcheshes nodar v'hada maisi lo b'machvas the marcheshes he umever hudi avar the asye b'machvas. That really the korban mincha was meant to be a marcheshes, as the Kohen declared it, and therefore this mincha was brought l'shem marcheshes. You'll ask me the question, why was it prepared in a machvas? That's because avurei ka'avrle. He violated the law. He shouldn't have brought the flour in a machvas, he should have brought it in a marcheshes. He used the wrong vessel and he messed up. And just like you said, that in the case of Darom, the spectator is going to say that really it's a koche kochim, as the Kohen declared it. And it was brought in the Darom by violation. So too, this flour in the mincha that was brought in a machvas, that was a violation. The Gemara says, Hasam, ki nami marcheshes nodar, ki maisi le b'machvas, machvas havya. Here the halacha is, as we're going to soon prove from a Mishnah at the end of Mishnah from the end of Menachos, that it doesn't matter what the neder was. Whatever the pledge was is irrelevant. The only thing that determines the nature of the mincha is what vessel was it prepared in. And therefore, if the original neder was, again, the spectators are listening carefully to the declaration of the Kohen, and the declaration of the Kohen was that this was a marcheshes korban, that's totally irrelevant. Because even if we grant the statement of the Kohen to be emes, to be correct, and the original pledge was for a marcheshes, it's totally irrelevant. Because the halacha is that if a person takes a neder for a marcheshes, and l'mais in actuality they prepared it in a machvas, the korban mincha has the status of a machvas. And how do I know this? Kirisnana omer harelai machvas vehevi marcheshes, or alternatively marcheshes vehevi b'machvas, mashehevi hevi v'yidei nidro lo yatsa. So the korban mincha will take on the status of the preparation, meaning of the kli, the vessel in which it was prepared, and that will be the determining factor in determining the status and the category of the mincha, and whatever his neder was is totally irrelevant. And therefore, if he took a neder for a marcheshes and lemaisa they prepared it in a machvas, the status of the mincha is that of a machvas, and the noder who took a neder to bring marcheshes will have to replace it and bring another mincha, and this time get it right, prepare it in a marcheshes. Therefore, when the Kohen who did the kmitza made a declaration that he was doing the kmitza for the purpose of a marcheshes, but at the end of the day, the korban was prepared in a machvas, then the status of the mincha is that of a machvas. And therefore the declaration of the Kohen is totally irrelevant. And then we'll determine, well, what was the original neder, the pledge of the noder? It was for a machvas. Where was the mincha prepared? In a machvas. And therefore, A, the korban mincha now is a machvas because it was prepared in a machvas, and B, the noder does not have to replace it because his original pledge was to bring a korban in a machvas. So the Gemara says, "V'dilma Omar Zu." What's the significance of Omar Zu? Omar Zu means that the noder who took the pledge picked up the flour in his hands and he said Zu. And when he says Zu, then if he said Zu leminchas a machvas, then it must be a machvas. We cannot change it. And what we learned earlier in the Mishnah, that it's the preparation that will determine the nature of the korban, that's only in a case where he left out the word zu. But if he added the word zu, then it's not enough that it was brought in a marcheshes, let's say. He said zu for machvas. If he said zu for machvas, then it's got to be a machvas. If it's not a machvas, and it was, let's say it was prepared in a marcheshes, then it's not valid. This not as we learned in a Mishnah. Again, it's the same Mishnah at the end of Masechta Menachos. Zula havi machmas. If the noder made a declaration, I'm bringing this flour for a machmas. The heavy marcheshes, but it was prepared in a different vessel as a marcheshes. Or let's say the opposite case. If he said, right, zu marcheshes, and then it was brought in a machvas, heavy machvas, harezu psula. So therefore, let's go back to our case. If the Kohen, when he did the kmitza, he said, this is going to be a marcheshes, and in truth, it was prepared in a machvas, then guess what? In this case, the Kohen's intention is really passing the korban mincha. Why? Because since the korban was brought according to the declaration of the Kohen as a marcheshes korban, if it was a case of zu, and indeed as the Kohen declares that the original owner, the noder who took the pledge, he pointed to this flour and he said, Harei zu marcheshes, that's what the Kohen is saying, then it won't be kosher. It would be a shalol lishma, because the original neder was machvas, and now the korban is called a marcheshes. So how does Reb Shimon get away with being machshir and validating the korban and make a claim that no one's going to pay any attention to the declaration of shalol lishma of the Kohen when that's not true? Because maybe it's a case of zu. And in a case of zu, everyone's going to take the declaration of the Kohen very seriously when he says that this korban, this mincha, was zu lemarcheshes, and therefore it really looks like a shalol lishma that passes the korban. Gemara says l'Rabbanan hachinam, ein hachinami. According to those who rejected Rab Shimon, that's the Mishnah itself of the Rabbanan, and that's true, right? The people will take the declaration of the Kohen very seriously, and maybe the original noder had in mind marcheshes, and even though it was brought in a machvas, it was a case of zu, and since it's a case of zu, it's a shalol lishma kavana that invalidates the korban. But l'Rabbi Shimon, kevan di omer Rabbi Shimon af yedei nidro yotza, alma kvi usa demona v'lav klumhu. Okay. So now we get into a different distinction that the Gemara is making here between the vessel, the kli itself, and the person who took the neder. And Rabbi Shimon is going to say the following, that what the Kohen declared is that the machvas is going to determine the korban as a machvas. And this is very strange, but the Kohen's declaration was emphasizing the mana. Mana means the vessel itself. The vessel is going to generate a status of marcheshes. Well, no one's going to take him seriously. The vessel is a machvas. It's not a marcheshes. So when the Kohen says, well, this mana is a korban minchas marcheshes, it's ridiculous. It makes no difference whether he said olai, I will bring a machvas, or I'm holding the flour, and this zu flour will be machvas. That's irrelevant. Why? Because what he said was that the mana in which the mincha is being prepared, that will determine the nature of the mincha and what category we put it in, and that's not true. The mana has no relevance because kviyusa de mana lav klumhu, right? When you designate a certain vessel, a certain kli, a mana for preparing the mincha, that's irrelevant. It all depends upon what you want it to be and what your pledge was. Ela me'ato, the Gemara still is going to challenge this principle that Maisa Mochiach Alav, Ola Sheshochat L'Shem Chatos Tiratza. Okay. Now, for this Gemara, I made myself a little chart. It might be Kedai to write this down. If we had a whiteboard, it would be Kedai. A Chatos Yochid, meaning with the exception of a Chatos Nasi, which we'll get into in a minute, in 99 out of 100 cases of a Chatos, you have two choices. You either bring a Se'ira, which is a female goat, or a Kizva, which is a female sheep. In both cases, you bring in a Keva. An Ola, on the other hand, you can have three options. You can either bring a Par or an Egel, which is a cow, and that's got to be male, an Ayil, which is a ram, which is male, or a Sa'ir, which is a male goat. In all three cases, whatever animal you choose for your Ola, it's always going to be a male carbon. For a Chatas, it's always going to be a female. So now, since those private parts of the body of the animal are exposed, then clearly they'll understand that the words and the declaration of the Kohen are meaningless. Why? Because the Kohen gets up and he says, well, this korban is not an ola, but rather a chatos. It can't be. The animal itself is a female animal. If his animal is a female, it can only be an ola, it can't be a chatos. Hai zocher, hai nekeva. So therefore, according to Reb Shimon's logic, the way Rabbah understood Reb Shimon, it's Ma'asav Mochiach Alav, and therefore the declaration of the Kohen can't make a dent. Gemara answers, no, there is such a thing as a chatas from a male animal, in this case a male goat, and that's the case of chatas nasi. So if the nasi violates a very serious crime, then he has to bring a chatos, and that chatos is a very unique chatos in the constellation of Zvachim. It's got to be from a male sa'ir, a male goat. So therefore, the people seeing this, and they hear the Kohen saying, well, this is being brought l'shem chatos, even though the animal is clearly male, right? And a male is appropriate for an ola, not for a chatos, but they'll say, wait, maybe he has in mind the chatos of a nasi. Again, it's very strange. I see over and over again as we go through the sugya that it's not really what the people are saying or thinking. It's conceptual. Anyway, let's go on. Gemara asks, Omar l'shem chatos yochid ma'iklamim. What if the declaration of the Kohen excluded the possibility of a chatos sa'ir shel nasi? He added the words chatos yochid. Chatos yochid is always, by definition, a female animal, and here the animal is male. Gemara answers, and the Gemara goes even further to ask the question: V'su chatas yochid sheshchato l'shem ola teratza. What about the case of a chatas yochid, which by definition has to be a nekeva, it has to be a female animal, and the Kohen makes a declaration that it's l'shem ola, which is by definition a male animal. And the animal is being brought as a female. So it can't be that the declaration of the Kohen should be taken seriously. Gemara answers, right? The Chatzkev also. Gemara answers, Michse be'alya. The private parts of the animal are covered by the tail. The tail covers it over. So the people don't distinguish between a male and a female. Gemara says, Ha'tenach hecha di isa kizba. Right, we're talking about an ola. What was the case again? We're talking about, chatos l'shem ola. So the original neder was l'shem chatos, and therefore it has to be a nekeva. But what happens if I see se'ira? Right, there are two options, as we said before, for a chatos. It could be either a se'ira or a kizba. And I see se'ira, ma'ikal memar. In the case of a goat doesn't have much of a tail, not like a sheep, and therefore it doesn't cover the private parts. And therefore, when the Kohen declares that this is an ola, then in the case of a se'ira, right? In the case of se'ira, it cannot be, right? It might be that again, what we're talking about in Ol Shem Chatos. So it might actually be that it's a male and not a female because there is no tail to cover the genital area. Ella bein zchor and bein zchor lava daitanin. The Gemara now backtracks, and the Gemara says the people are not looking to see, the privates of the animal and to see whether it's a male or female. Forget it. Forget about that. Okay. So therefore, again, we come back to the principle of Rabbi Shimon, and that is that the carbon has to be puzzled because the people will take the declaration of the Kohen very seriously. It's not obviously deceitful or sheker because they can't tell whether the animal is male or female. Pesach sheshchotel l'shem osham li. Okay, now we get into Korban Pesach. Korban Pesach has to be a lamb that's less than a lamb or a kid, meaning a goat, that's less than a year old. That we derive from Psukim. And the declaration of the Kohen was that it's Asham, it's a Korban Asham. Now, a Korban Asham, the Torah says, is an ayil. An ayil, by definition, is an animal, a ram that's more than a year old. So once again, it's obvious. The Gemara is assuming that the spectator knows the difference between whether it's within the first year or it's the second year. The high ben shana, the high ben shnatayim. Gemara answers, came in the Ika Asham Nazir, Vasham Mitzora, right? A Nazir who became Tomei, after he's Mitayr himself, he has to bring a Korban Asham. And the Korban Asham, the Torah says in Vayikra, just 1 second. No, I'm sorry, the Parsha of Nazir is in Bamidbar, right? And in Parshas Nasa, right? So there in Bamidbar Perek Vav, the Torah says that the Nazir will bring a keves as an asham. And that could be even if it's less than a year old. And with regard to what else do we have here? We have Asham Mitzora. So let's say Mitzora contracted Tumah. Then he has to bring an Asham, and the Torah calls it a Keves. And if it's a Keves, it might be in his first year, and therefore you cannot differentiate between that and a Korban Pesach, which is also in the first year. So again, you see that the spectator is always trying to figure out, are there cases in which the declaration of the Kohen is actually true? Amar l'shum asham, asham gzelos, l'shum asham me'ilos, mai ikol meimar. Right, so if, let's say, a person violates me'ilah b'shogeg, he has to bring a Korban asham. Or alternatively, and in case of a person who denies a claim against him, and then he takes a shvuah to support his denial, and then we find out that his denial was false, he's got to bring, amongst other things, a Korban asham. And the Korban asham, in both the cases of Asham Gzelos and Asham Me'ilos, have to be in the second year, and therefore when he brings the Korban Pesach, and the declaration of the Kohen is that it's for the purpose of Asham Gzelos or Asham Me'ilos, then it's obvious that the Kohen is saying Sheker V'Chazov, because a Pesach has to be within its first year. V'su, and furthermore, Asham Gzelos, Asham Me'ilos, Shafton L'Shum Pesach Liratzu, right, since Asham Gzelos and Asham Me'ilos have to be in the second year, and Pesach has to be in the first year. When he declares that this is a Pesach, he's obviously saying Sheker, the Pesach ben Shana v'hayin ben shtei shnanim, and therefore the carbon should be kosher according to your logic in Rabbi Shimon. Ella, the Gemara says, Bein shel shana, bein shel shtei shana, v'lava daitinchi. The spectator can't distinguish between a year-old animal or more than a year old. Anika ben shana, the Michsei, you have a premature, if I have a precocious animal that is only a year old but looks like a 2-year-old, or the opposite, Ika ben Shnatim to Nefsek ben Shana, you have an older animal that looks like a younger animal. This is what we all hope to be, right? So therefore, once again, the carbon is possible even according to Reb Shimon because the argument, the declaration of the Kohen of Shalol Lishma could be feasible, and nobody knows for sure that it's sheker. Again, soyer shechshchato l'shum asham liratzu, and now again there's an obvious difference between a soyer and a kizba. The high tzemer v'high soyer, right? The sheep is covered with wool. And until he shears off the wool, then it's obvious that you're talking about a sheep. And the goat, on the other hand, is covered not with wool, but with hair. So the Gemara answers, Ika dichra ukma ukmahu. Right? That there might be an assumption on the part of the people that we're talking about a ram after it was shorn, after they took off the tzemer. Gemara asks now, Egel upar sheshchotu l'shum pesach v'yosham li rotzu. Right? So let's say we said that in a carbon ola. So what are we doing? Right, he shechted an ola, which could be a par or an egel. And the declaration of the Kohen was what? That it's for the purpose of a Pesach or an Asham. And a Pesach or an Asham would not be brought from a par. The egel par Pesach v'asham leka, right? A carbon Pesach never has a par. It never is from a cow or a calf. And the same is true for an asham, which we said again before that the asham is in its second year. But keep in mind that the asham is not brought from a par or an egel. So therefore it should be kosher. Enochinami. At this point, the Gemara establishes that Reb Shimon in this case would be machshir the carbon, right? The asham is always male, and if someone shechted a par or an egel and he declared that he was doing it for the sake of a Pesach or an asham, then obviously this is not true because, as we said before, Pesach has to come from anything but a par or an egel, come from a keves, or it could come from a gedi, meaning a goat, but it can't come from a par or a calf. And the same is true for an asham. Seinochinami, the Gemara says in such a case, according to Reb Shimon, the carbon would be kosher. Okay.